Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Islands of Ideas online public lecture series. Firstly, as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of the island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, as custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Katrina McLeod, and I'm head of the Ecology and Biodiversity Centre at the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies, and I'm going to be your Master of Ceremonies for this afternoon. I'm really keen to hear the presentations today. I'm particularly looking forward to the discussions afterwards. But before we get on to that, a little bit about the Island of Ideas online public lecture series itself. This programme has been purposefully designed to keep the ideas flowing during this COVID period when we're unable to host live public events. Each year, the university presents hundreds of free lectures, forums, seminars, and workshops, not just for our students and alumni, but also for the wider community. These are an important part of the university's role, and it's why we're hosting forums such as this one this afternoon. Today's lecture and panel discussion are jointly presented by the Australian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society, AMOS, and the Australian Marine Science Association, AMSA, as part of National Science Week. AMSA is one of Australia's oldest marine science professional organisations and has been promoting marine science for over 50 years. AMOS supports and fosters interest in meteorology, oceanography and other related sciences. Both are committed to sharing their knowledge of the marine environment, the atmosphere, oceans and the issues that affect these environments. And today's lectures are focused on that sort of area. The topic today is one that I know has been front and centre for many people this year, bushfires. Whilst these have had a devastating impact on our terrestrial systems, land-based systems, our two excellent presenters and experts in their fields will help us understand a little bit more about the broader effects of bushfires on our atmosphere, water and the oceans. But before we get started, a few housekeeping notes before we get underway. Your microphone, camera, chat function and hand raising functions have all been disabled. That's so that the speakers are not interrupted. But we would encourage you to ask questions. And this can be done by typing them into the Q&A function that you see on the screen down at the bottom. A selection of these will be answered during the Q&A section towards the end of the presentation. So please get them up there as soon as you can. Finally, this lecture is being recorded for later access on the YouTube and SoundCloud channels. Okay, so let's get things underway. The first of our two presenters today is Dr. Paul Fox-Hughes, who's a researcher from the Bureau of Meteorology, and he has specific and considerable expertise in the interactions of fire and weather. And he's going to explain to us how the weather influences fire and vice versa, and what we might expect in the future. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Katrina. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now.
I think we're still just seeing you. Have you been able to share?
Just a sec. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, good. Thank you.
That's better. Thank you, Paul.
Yes, thanks for that. So, fire are the topic's a very broad topic, and we'll look at just a couple of aspects of them today. There's a lot going on in this area. And hopefully I'll even be able to change my screen. Oh, there we go. So it's a very topical area. The picture we're seeing there is from the 3rd of January this year, showing the fires over Eastern Australia, particularly Eastern Victoria and New South Wales. And they really highlight the interaction of how the weather influences fire and how fire in turn interacts with the weather. And we'll ask the question, what might we see of these things in future? We haven't got time to talk a lot about these, but we'll touch on some of the obvious things and some of the less obvious things. And there's a lot, as I said, that's going on in this space in the science, both here in Tasmania, in Australia and and globally. So with that in mind, let's get into it. In science, we try to simplify things first up to provide models of how the real world, simple models of how the real world behaves, and the fire space is no different. We have this idea of a fire triangle where the three things that are essential to fire are oxygen, heat, and fuel, and we look at each of these in turn just very briefly. So oxygen first up, it's essential for a fire to keep going, and you can see the necessity and the impacts of having oxygen from this satellite image, which again is from early January this year. You can see the wind has blown the smoke over the Tasman Sea from the fires in New South Wales and Victoria. That oxygen is supplied, to say, by the wind, and the wind also removes the combustion products, the smoke, from the vicinity of the fire, allowing it to keep burning. So that's a fairly simple and straightforward thing, but inevitably, when you look closer, there are all sorts of subtleties and complications. We'll have a look at just one of those, and that's something called downslope winds. So I have an example here from an event in Tasmania last year. It's not actually a fire example, but it illustrates the fairly dramatic effect of downslope winds. If you look at the image to the right, you can see the arrow over Tasmania pointing northwards. That is where this cross section on the left comes from. And what you can see in black is the topography of Tasmania with the steep slopes of the Great Western Tiers. And above that is the atmosphere. And represented in colour is the wind speed of the air. So the darker, stronger colours are higher wind speeds. The lighter colours down near the surface, if you can see my mouse in the lee of the slopes, are lighter winds. The yellow lines represent the path that is taken by the air as it moves through the atmosphere in this particular instance. So a couple of things worth noting here are that stronger air is brought down the lee of the winds of the Great Western Tiers. It's not just that in the lee of the tiers the wind is lighter, but in fact in this particular case, for various reasons to do with the state of the atmosphere, we get this what's called downslope wind effect. And so you have a region of very localized strong winds, but you also have a region of much lighter winds. So those strong localized winds in circumstances where you have fires can actually result in transport of embers. And in fact, we saw that over the summer again during the bushfires in, or actually all the way down the east coast. There were cases in Queensland, cases in New South Wales, and cases in Victoria where strong winds lofted, and often downslope winds lofted embers much further than the fire would have been able to progress otherwise. This is an area that is a topic of research currently, and both here in Australia and globally. And it's an important thing that we get our hands on and understand better. The second topic we'll look at, the second arm of this triangle, is the fuel, the stuff that actually burns, the vegetation. So there are a number of aspects of this operating on a range of different timescales. On a timescale of hours, the atmosphere again dries out vegetation. In many cases, the vegetation is already fairly dry, but the dry air desiccates that vegetation even further and preconditions it for burning. This particular case is Kangaroo Island in early January again, when much of the west of the island was burnt. You can see again the winds having the effect of blowing the smoke offshore, but it does illustrate the fact that you've got this large amount of air blowing over the vegetation. On a longer time scale, you have the influence of the atmosphere through rainfall affecting vegetation on a time scale of days to years. And in this particular case, this is the southeastern Australia during December, showing the root zone soil moisture, which is to say the moisture that's available to plants in the soil. The red in particular, or the dark red, shows that part of the continent which is at the lowest 1% of the record of root zone soil moisture, which is to say much of the eastern seaboard of New South Wales and Victoria. A third timescale, again, much longer than the other two, basically influences the type and abundance of fuels of vegetation that might be around. So the rainfall climate sets up conditions for vegetation to grow and in some cases to burn. So a broad range of timescales that the weather influences the potential for fire in these circumstances. Third one of the triangle is heat, and in this particular case, an ignition source. And the key one for the atmosphere is lightning. Lightning can act to start a fire, and often in circumstances where it's difficult to control those fires. So in remote and inaccessible areas, such as we had, for example, in late December of 2018, before the large fires in Tasmania. So in this particular one, you can see particular image. You can see clusters of lightning represented by those orange dots, and in particular in the southwest of Tasmania, the Gel River fire ignited and caused many problems and a lot of smoke. But that particular fire was influenced again by this rainfall climate, which has been becoming more established in Tasmania over the last couple of decades. So, for example, here we have an image from the State of the Climate report by the Bureau and CSIRO for 2018. What that shows is a broad area of the west of the country, which was which had experienced over a period of 20 years, essentially record, but certainly very much above average warm season rainfall. But the west of Tasmania experienced the driest warm season rainfall conditions compared to the average of anywhere in the country, and that basically set the scene for lightning then to ignite fires. And this was the case both last year and in 2016. How that happened, how lightning acts to in particular areas to make fires much more likely is something that again is a topic of research both here in Tasmania, nationally and globally again. So we've had a look very briefly at how the weather influences fire, but how fire influences the weather also occurs on a range of different timescales. One of the more spectacular examples is something called a fire-generated thunderstorm, or a pyrocumulonimbus. What we've got here is the fire from Denali in 2013, where this fire-generated thunderstorm developed over the Denali fire, caused its own lightning strikes, which fortunately were over the water in this particular case, so didn't cause more problems. But it's these sorts of events operate on a timescale of hours. Again, they've been a topic of research here at the University of Tasmania and through the Bureau and nationally. On a broader timescale, the fires influence the weather because they change the state of the land surface and the way that sunlight is absorbed or reflected. In this particular case, we've got, for example, Kangaroo Island again, where the western third of the island, as I said, was burnt out. And the image at the right there shows exactly what that looks like on the ground. And there's obviously a profound difference between the land surface acts on the atmosphere and vice versa in that case compared to when it's vegetated a week or so beforehand. Again, more broadly, fire can influence the weather by the increase in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere on a scale of years to centuries and beyond. So what's the future? Well, in a sense, the future is now. We've seen changes already. So the changes in Tasmania that have occurred in warm season rainfall, the changes in temperature, which have increased the amount of evapotranspiration that occurs in vegetation that preconditions them to make them more likely to burn. And finally, the changes where, this is a picture of Siberia over, I think it was June of this year, where the increase in fire activity because of warming and thawing of permafrost has released a large amount of carbon. So these effects are things that have been predicted, and we're starting to see occurring on an almost annual basis. So just quickly to recap what we've looked at, how the weather influences fire, in turn how fire influences the weather, and very briefly what the future might hold for these interactions. There's a lot of work in these areas, a lot of really interesting science, but this has just touched on a couple of aspects of each of those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I can see we've got a couple of questions coming through already, but just so everybody's aware, we're going to do the questions as part of the panel session at the end. So hold those thoughts and jot them down in the Q&A section at the bottom on the online section, and we'll get them right at the end. We'll run through those. So we'll move on now to our second presenter, Dr. Pete Strutton. Pete's a colleague of mine here at IMAS and a very highly respected biological oceanographer. And he's going to describe how dust and bushfire smoke deposited in the ocean can stimulate plankton growth. Over to you, Pete.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
We can see that, Pete. Yep, you're good. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Katrina, for the introduction, and thanks to AMSA and AMOS and you, Taz, for the invitation to speak today. The topic of my talk today is the impact of dust and bushfire aerosols on ocean productivity. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the funding agencies that have made this work possible, the Australian Research Council through its support of the Discovery Program and the Centres of Excellence, as well as Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System, who support the deployment of ocean observing infrastructure around Australia. And I chose this image here of a ruby sea dragon native to Western Australia because it looks a lot like the satellite images of plumes of smoke and dust coming off Eastern Australia that I'll show later in my talk. I also wanted to acknowledge the people that have worked on this with me. So this is a large collaborative effort. It's a group of us from IMAS and CSIRO have been working on this together with colleagues at Princeton University and Duke University in the US, the Barcelona Supercomputing Centre in Spain, and Plymouth Marine Lab in the UK. And I wanted to particularly highlight the early career researchers who either initiated this work or have done significant pieces of analyses or both. That's Joan Lort, Jake Weiss and Morgan Perrin from IMAS, and Wei Tang from Princeton. So first I thought I would explain what we mean by ocean productivity. In the ocean, just like on land, plants are the base of the marine food chain. But in the ocean, these plants are microscopic single-celled plankton called phytoplankton. They contain chlorophyll and they photosynthesize, so they're green. So we can measure their abundance by measuring the greenness of the ocean. They're incredibly diverse. There's thousands of species, and this image here just shows a couple of them. So like land plants, phytoplankton need light and nutrients to grow. So the highest productivity places of the ocean where nutrients are brought to the surface by either upwelling or mixing. So that's places like the North Atlantic, the southern temperate latitudes, and upwelling regions. The ocean gyres, on the other hand, so these blue areas here, are very low productivity because they have extremely low concentrations of dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus. This is a satellite image of global chlorophyll, and I'll use satellite chlorophyll images throughout this talk to indicate ocean productivity. So phytoplankton play an important role in the carbon cycle, and they contribute about half the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere that we breathe. So when they grow at the surface, they take up carbon dioxide, some of it from the atmosphere, and when they're consumed or die, they sink into the deep ocean. So the carbon that they've captured is stored in the deep ocean or in sediments. And we refer to this as the biological carbon pump because it's pumping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and into the ocean. So I'll refer to that biological carbon pump several times throughout my talk. So I've talked a little about the role of nitrogen and phosphorus as nutrients. And as I said, the ocean gyres are home to very low productivity because of low levels of dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus. So the top left shows a map of the global distribution of surface dissolved nitrate. So we can see areas like the gyres that have very low dissolved nitrogen. We can also see places like the North Pacific, the tropical Pacific, and the Southern Ocean, where high levels of nitrogen persist. So for decades, oceanographers asked, what was preventing phytoplankton from consuming this nitrogen? Turns out the answer is extremely low levels of dissolved iron. Iron is required by phytoplankton in trace amounts, and it's also present in the ocean at very low concentrations. So these places where there's leftover nutrients are places where phytoplankton stop photosynthesis because they run out of iron before they run out of nitrogen. So the bottom left panel shows global chlorophyll again, but also on this plot are the locations of ship-based experiments that have either purposefully added iron to the ocean or observed the impact of natural iron fertilization from iron sediments, island sediments or hydrothermal vents. And the bottom right panel shows how such an experiment might work. Iron's added to the ocean, in this case into an eddy, and it stimulates a phytoplankton bloom. And while the phytoplankton are blooming, they're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and some of that carbon, so the strengthening of the biological carbon pump, is depositing carbon into the deep waters and into the sediments. So I could talk for a long time about these open ocean iron experiments, but one of the reasons that I chose this schematic is that it also shows some of the sources of iron, natural sources of iron to the ocean, things like melting sea ice, melting icebergs, hydrothermal vents, and atmospheric inputs. So for this talk, the things that are relevant there are bushfire, aerosols, and dust. So before I get into detail about the impact of fires, I just wanted to spend a slide talking just about dust. Specifically, I want to highlight this emerging work that Joanne Lord, who I mentioned before, is leading, looking at the productivity of the Tasman Sea. So terrestrial dust is about 5% iron by weight, and when it settles on the ocean, this iron can become biologically available. In the top row, I've got some satellite chlorophyll images for averages of the summer of 2009, 2010, and 2011. And we see very high concentrations of chlorophyll in 2009 and 10, much lower in 2011. Sorry, this is Tasmania and New Zealand. This is the southern Tasman Sea. This also corresponds in the second row here to periods of high and low dust. So we see in this, these are atmospheric concentrations of dust, and we see they're very high in 2009 and 2010, much lower in 2011. So we have high chlorophyll in high dust years, low chlorophyll in low dust years. So as many of us know, the decade of the 2000s was the period of the Millennium drought in Australia, by some measures the most severe drought since European settlement in Australia. And it resulted in increased dust loads in the atmosphere. And in the time series in the bottom here, we can see throughout the 2000s an increase in the average chlorophyll concentration in the Tasman Sea through the period of Millennium drought. And that was stopped by the drought-breaking La Nina of 2010-11, which decreased the dust load in the atmosphere. So the conclusion here is that dust from the Australian droughts impacts ocean productivity in the Tasman and probably further afield. So any future changes in drought could have a significant impact on ocean productivity. So now to talk specifically about the fires of last summer, I want to explain how they might have impacted ocean productivity. On the left here is an image from November before the worst of the fires, but it does show a huge plume of dust and also bushfire smoke emanating from the fires in New South Wales and being blown into the Tasman Sea. So as we can see from the map on the bottom right, the areas of the Tasman Sea and the South Pacific border these areas that are either limited by the availability of nitrogen or by the availability of iron. So deposition of dust, which is the source of iron, is likely to stimulate productivity in the southern iron-limited waters, whereas the deposition of bushfire aerosols, which contain iron, nitrogen and phosphorus, might stimulate productivity in both the nitrogen-limited areas and the iron-limited areas. So we wanted to look at the impacts of these summer bushfires on ocean productivity. So on the left here, we see a sequence of monthly maps, and these are satellite and model combined observations of the load of atmospheric black carbon in the atmosphere. And we use this as a tracer of bushfire smoke. So these go from November through 2019 through February 2020. So wherever it's red, there's a lot of atmospheric black carbon. So this does show, it looks like an impressive amount of black carbon in the atmosphere, but it doesn't really give us an historical context. So for that, we generated a time series from a box here in the South Pacific. And this bottom panel here shows time series of that same parameter, atmospheric black carbon, from 2004 to 2020, indicating that the atmospheric load of black carbon in the summer of 2019-20 was unlike anything we've ever seen in this record here. So using atmospheric circulation data, we can show where the aerosols emanating from the bushfires went, and there's one example shown here. This is for one specific fire in the Snowy Mountains in January 2020, and you can project where the atmospheric parcels would have gone, and we can confirm that they did go into the South Pacific. Note also that some of these air parcels went directly over Tasmania as well, and that's important for the data that I'll show next. So Andy Bowie's group at IMAS runs a network of aerosol sampling stations, one of which is on Mount Wellington. And during the 2019-20 summer, they made some crucial measurements that helped us to understand the composition of the aerosols coming out of southeastern Australian fires. So the first important point to make is that the aerosols sampled in January associated with the air parcels that I just talked about contained elevated levels of a chemical called levoglucosan, which is a signature chemical for biomass burning. So this allows us to say for sure that the samples during this period were aerosols that were generated by bushfires, as opposed to other periods in the record that were sampling urban emissions. So during this period where samples of bushfire smoke was being measured by the sampling station, in the blue line in the top panel here, we see elevated levels of iron, and we also see elevated levels of labile iron. That just means how soluble the iron is. So, so that's important for the impact on the ocean. This means that, so the fact that it's highly soluble or highly labile means that when it enters the ocean, it's more likely to have a biological impact. And the average values for both the iron concentrations and the solubility are shown in these horizontal black lines. So in each case, the values for the last summer were well above average for that time of year. So what happened to the ocean productivity? So on the left here, I'm showing those same panels that I showed before that shows the atmospheric load of black carbon And in these panels here for the same months, I'm showing the chlorophyll concentration measured in the surface of the ocean measured by satellite. So this is the anomaly compared to normal. So anywhere that's red has higher values than normal. And some of these values are more than 100% above average. So in the middle right, as we saw, these aerosols here were unprecedented in the record of aerosols that we have for this part of the South Pacific. And in the lower right-hand panel here, we've done the same thing for chlorophyll. We have more than 20 years of satellite chlorophyll measurements globally. And for this box in the South Pacific, there's nothing in that more than 20-year record that compares to the chlorophyll values or the productivity that we saw in 2019-20. So clearly the deposition of these aerosols had a huge impact on the productivity of the South Pacific. So that was the view from satellites. What about the in-situ response? Well, the South Pacific is probably one of the least visited parts of the ocean by research and merchant ships, but fortunately we have a global network of profiling floats called Argo that have been sampling temperature and salinity in the oceans for 2 decades now. So the bottom right image shows how these floats work. They sample from 2,000 meters to the surface every 10 days and transmit their data back to the lab via satellite. And in recent years, these floats have been carrying biological and chemical sensors, and we can use them to look at the impact of these aerosol inputs last summer. So the top panel here shows a map. Here's South America and New Zealand, and this box in the South Pacific, and some little squiggles where these floats, well, we found floats that sampled the bloom, and the data from those floats is plotted here. So we have 3 floats in the 3 different colors, and these colored bands here indicate the average seasonal cycle with uncertainties, and then the solid lines are what we measured last summer. And you can see in each case, the red, the yellow, and the green, sorry, the blue floats are outside of what's normal for this time of year when the aerosols are being deposited in the ocean. So this parameter here is particles in the ocean, which we assume are chlorophyll or assume they're phytoplankton, and we confirm that by looking at satellite data in these 2 colored boxes here, so red and blue, and we see the what's average for this time of year, and in each case the data from that box exceeded what was normal for that time of year. So this confirms that the particles we saw contain chlorophyll, so they're definitely phytoplankton. So we're experiencing a huge bloom in this part of the ocean. These Argo floats also carry other sensors for dissolved nitrogen, dissolved oxygen, and other phytoplankton proxies, and our PhD student Jake Weiss is starting to explore those now. So to conclude, in large areas of the ocean, productivity is limited by the availability of iron or nitrogen or both. Dust and bushfire aerosols have the potential to supply one or both of these nutrients. And we saw unprecedented blooms in the South Pacific and the Great Australian Bight, but I didn't mention that in this talk, in 2019-20. I showed several lines of evidence that indicate that a bushfire source for those aerosols that generated the blooms. And I didn't cover this, but the stimulation of ocean productivity and the biological carbon pump sequestered an amount of CO2 that was almost equal to the amount released by the fires when they were burning. So it's fairly clear that the climate is warming, and it's less clear exactly what will happen to droughts under climate change, but the climate for fire is changing. So longer term changes in drought and fires have the potential to cause large changes in ocean productivity, and future work should look at these potential impacts and how they're connected to the rest of the ocean. Thank you very much.
Apologies for looking off to the side. I was just looking at the questions there. Thank you, Pete. I think everyone will agree that both presentations were fascinating. So now it's our chance to kick off questions. It's over to the audience now to ask some questions, and we've got quite a few coming in. So I'll make the most of our time and jump straight into those. It just vanished. There it is. The first one, Paul, I think is directed at you. With the level of environmental and faunal destruction in megafires, is there any possibility of using subacoustic shock waves to interrupt combustion? Similar method to blowing out a candle.
I'm not sure. It's not an area that I have any expertise in, but one of the things that I didn't mention in connection with lightning, but sort of implied, was that, you know, the lightning fires tend to be the larger fires because they tend to occur, or they can occur, in remote areas. I mean, fires are just as likely in many ways to ignite in urban areas or the edges of urban areas, but usually there's a fire truck on hand within half an hour and it squirts the fire out and that's the end of it. In remote areas, of course, it's much more difficult to get at anywhere near the ignition source, and so by the time resources are able to get to the fires, they're much more difficult to put out, and that's what we've seen over the last summer, what we saw in Tasmania in 2019 and 2016, what people generally observe. So look, to answer the question, possibly, but it's still going to be an issue with the sort of remote fires fires that start off remote and then expand to become the mega fires that we saw, say, at Gosford's Mountain, that are incredibly difficult to control. As really, it did throw another line on something I wanted to talk about.
Yep, no worries. Thank you for that, Paul. Pete, this one's for you. To what extent has this type of variability in the carbon cycle been incorporated into climate models?
Yeah, I think the short answer is not at all. So, and that's kind of what I'm advocating for here, is that once we start to get a better understanding of how these, or the magnitude of the effect that these aerosols might have on ocean productivity, then we could perhaps start to incorporate this into climate models. So so what it would require is climate models that simulate fire and simulate the aerosols, and then I think the more straightforward part would be to calculate the impact on ocean productivity. I think the simulating the fires probably has much larger uncertainties around it.
Thank you. One more for you, Pete. Clearly those Argo floats were a very important device for collecting your data. How do they actually work? How do the Argo floats actually work, and how were the deployments organised?
Yeah, so Argo floats have been around for about 20 years. They're metal cylinders. They're about 1.5 meters high, weigh about 50 kilos, and they are deployed in the ocean, and they drift around measuring temperature and salinity every 10 days for hopefully 3 to 4 years. So that program, international program, has been going for decades now, and CSIRO deploys about 10% of the global array of those floats, the ones that measure temperature and salinity. So more recently, CSIRO and IMAS together have been funded by Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System to deploy floats that have biological and chemical sensors on them. So our goal is it's a really efficient way to make measurements in the ocean, especially in inaccessible areas of the ocean like the South Pacific or under the ice in Antarctica. And so our goal is to get up to a place where we can also be deploying 10% of the global array of those biogeochemical Argo floats, and to address questions like seasonal and interannual variability of productivity and ocean acidification and other climate change impacts.
Cool. Paul, back to you. Tasmania experienced unprecedented dry lightning strikes. Why are we experiencing them now, and what causes dry lightning?
Okay. Again, you could talk about this stuff for hours, but briefly, we possibly haven't experienced unprecedented lightning. What we've and we can't be certain of that because the lightning detection networks that we use have only been in place for really 15 years, and their sensitivity has increased over that time. So we don't really have a long baseline of real data to support an answer one way or another. But there's some work that's been done, again, work that's occurred at the University of Tasmania looking at regional climate models or the output of regional climate models and some proxies for lightning. So basically how unstable the atmosphere is. If the atmosphere is more unstable, lightning is more likely. And what that's shown is actually quite interesting. Over the area of Tasmania, what the models are suggesting is that the amount of lightning, the amount of atmospheric instability, has actually decreased very slightly over recent years and is likely to continue decreasing very slightly during the rest of this century for very good physical reasons. You may know that the subtropical belt around the Earth is expanding slightly with climate change. Again, that's been modelled and it's been observed. And what we think is going on in this model result is that as that band moves over or gets closer to Tasmania, the stability generally increases. And so the instability decreases, the amount of lightning perhaps decreases. But the kicker here is that while that's happening, we've also got the effect, as we saw in the talk, where the western half of Tasmania, and Tasmania generally, but more particularly in the western half, during the warm season, the season that's most prone to bushfires, is actually drying out. So while the absolute amount of lightning, is according to this modelling and perhaps decreasing, what we're seeing is a very definitive increase in the amount of lightning-induced fires. So before the 1990s, in Western Tasmania, the received wisdom was that lightning-generated fires just don't occur in Western Tasmania. All the fires were generated by people one way or another. But what we've seen over the last couple of decades, and particularly 2019, 2016 were really significant years here. But there are other fires, for example, in 2003, I think it was, the Franklin Donaldson fire, late 2002, fires that burned 100,000 hectares in a single go, in a single fire, took $3 or $4 million of resources to bring under control and months of effort. So those sorts of fires have been increasing over the last couple of decades. And it's more because of the drying of the environment than the lightning. So again, it's the answer was sort of off at an angle to the question, but I think it addresses an important thing that the question was implying.
Thank you. I'll stay with you, actually. There's another question for you here, which might hopefully be fairly straightforward. I don't know. Is there a standard calculator for how much carbon is released to the atmosphere when certain vegetation communities are burnt? And do you know if this is part of the national greenhouse account?
Look, the very easy answer to this is I don't know, sorry. There are obviously greenhouse accounting or carbon accounting work that's been undertaken, but I'm not sure to how much an extent bushfire is taken into account there. So
that's one for us to look into. No worries.
Well, I'm going to take a guess that I think there must be standard formulas for. It's sort of related to, there's a couple of questions there about the ocean productivity part. There must be standard calculators that know that when X number of million hectares of this kind of vegetation is burned, it releases this much CO2.
Yeah.
And as for whether it's accounted for in national greenhouse accounting, I'm going to guess yes for that as well, because things like deforestation and fires are so prevalent and they're reasonably well mapped that I think there'd have to be, I'm sure the error bars are large, but I'm sure they are accounted for in some way.
suspect you're right, Pete. I just couldn't put my finger on.
Yeah.
There's another interesting subtlety there too, of course, in that the severity of a fire will influence those accounts. And one of the things that people noted with the fires this year in particular was how severe they were. That you know, as we saw that Kangaroo Island image that I showed, you know, whole landscapes were denuded, whereas in many fires in the past, the you know, the fires burnt in a mosaic pattern, so it will burn you know, in a severe fashion. But there are other areas that it will barely touch. There was less of that, and that will of course influence the amount of carbon released and complicate the answer.
Cool. So we think it is the case, participants, but we're not 100% sure. So any of you out there who knows the answer to that one categorically, feel free to put it in the Q&A session, and I'll inform the speakers. In the meantime, Peter, another one for you, Pete. This question's come from someone who says, sorry if they missed it in the talk, but where do you get the estimate for biological carbon pump from, which equaled the amount of CO2 released by fire?
Yeah, okay, so I did have a slide on that, but I took it out because I was running over time. So, like we were just saying, there are estimates for how much CO2 was released by the fires. So the numbers are that 226 million tonnes of carbon as CO2 was released by those fires. That's actually more than Australia's annual emissions from anthropogenic activities. So in the ocean, there's this, you know, there's an entire field of study that converts satellite chlorophyll measurements using assumptions about you know, light availability and phytoplankton physiology and the depth of the mixed layer to get at productivity. So changing just biomass into actual productivity, so how much carbon is being sucked out of the atmosphere, and then turning that into, again, we have estimates that we know in certain parts of the ocean, 20% of that's going to get sequestered into the deep ocean. So those are the sorts of calculations that we did. So the estimate is that 226 million tonnes of carbon as CO2 is released, and 180 million tonnes was sequestered in or made a much larger box, you know, in the South Pacific. It included the Great Australian Bight as well. So approximately 80% of the CO2 emitted by the fires, we estimate, was sequestered into the ocean by the blooms that were generated by the fires.
Sorry, I was getting a bit distracted there because the questions are appearing and disappearing in front of me. It's great. Closer to home, Pete, there's another one for you. What do you think the implications of smoke particulates are for the Australian marine environment, i.e. within the National Marine Estate?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on that, but I guess I would say two things. One, I think that the deposition of aerosols into the ocean, the main impact that they would be having would be on altering the nutrient levels and stimulating productivity, like which was the focus of my talk. But I think perhaps if there's a perceived impact of particles, so ash, other particulates or other perturbations to chemistry, they might be most significant in runoff. So when rain falls on the areas that are heavily impacted by fires, and then that goes into rivers, and we had a bit of that. You know, we had a horrible bushfire season and followed by some heavy rains, and so the impacts in watersheds and runoff to the ocean could be significant, but I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, certainly as a scientist who does work in that area, I'm pretty confident that's going to be a significant effect. Is the coastal runoff and the changes in our estuarine cycles. Oops, something's popped up there. So quickly back to you, Paul, another lightning one here. Is lightning as an ignition source exclusively dry lightning, or can fire start even during a thunderstorm with precipitation?
Yes is the short answer, and the slightly longer answer is that, you know, if you do get, say, a couple of millimetres rainfall associated with a thunderstorm, often that rainfall is absorbed before it makes its way through the canopy of a forest, if it falls in a forest area, for example. And so if you know, fire agency and bureau staff tend to think that if anything less than about 5 millimetres of rainfall doesn't really count for putting out a potential lightning ignition. And so that's one strand of the answer. Another strand is that often the thunderstorm fall in a fairly narrow shaft under the storm itself. But lightning can actually occur off to the side of those shafts, so you can get potentially quite heavy rainfall from a thunderstorm, you know, 10 or 20 millimetres, for example. Eventually, you could also get a lightning ignition somewhere off to the side. So it's not as simple as the lightning occurs exactly where the rain occurs. An interesting other example is that, an important other example is that often it's the soils themselves that burn, particularly in Tasmania. If you have organic soils where over tens or hundreds of thousands of years, this accumulation of dead material has turned into soil itself. Lots of soils can actually burn, and we've seen that. You know, we saw that in Tasmania. You see that in the permafrost that I alluded to briefly in my slide set. So potentially you can get rainfall into that, and even if it's been ignited, and that rainfall won't put the fire out. There was a spectacular example in Tasmania in, I think it was 2007, a fire at a place called the Fury Gorge, which we of to the northwest of Cradle Mountain, and the fire agencies, particularly parks, were reasonably desperately concerned about this because they didn't want the fire to get away and to burn through the national park. It would have been an ecological disaster. So they put a lot of resources into putting this fire out. They put up an automatic weather station at the top of the gorge, and the gorge was actually about 1,000 metres deep, as I recall. The fire was burning about 700 metres up the slope. Firefighters had to crawl over the scrub and then dig into the ground to try and put the fire out. And then a thunderstorm occurred, and the rain gauge on the automatic weather station measured something like, I'm going to get the details wrong, but it's something like 100 millimetres of rain. Everyone clapped and cheered and went home. And 3 days later, a little tendril of smoke came up because even though a huge amount of rainfall, a lot of it had run off, and what had soaked in hadn't been enough to put this fire in the organics. So, yeah, the short answer again is fires can start and continue to burn even during a thunderstorm.
Thank you. Yes, coming from the west coast of Scotland originally, I have a fair affinity with peat fires and how that can keep going for a very long time. So thank you for that, Paul. Pete, we're getting close, but we've got probably time for a couple more quick ones, sorry. Could you expand, Pete, on the conclusion of roughly equal carbon released from fires as taken up via the stimulated biological carbon pump? How confident are you in that result?
Yeah, so that was the calculations I was describing before, but I didn't say anything about the confidence in the result. And I would say, yes, there are large error bars on that. So, you know, we have about 30% accuracy in calculating chlorophyll from satellites. Then we take that chlorophyll number and we turn it into productivity. Then we guess how much is, not guess, but we calculate how much is actually sequestered out of the surface ocean, and each one of those steps has error bars. So there's large uncertainties, but you know, it's in the same ballpark.
Okay, so I've got another one here that I actually think could apply to both of you. So we'll see what happens. I might start with Paul and then you can have a crack. If the fires had happened in the west rather than the east coast, would the deposition of dust and aerosols have occurred onto land instead of sea, and therefore not have led to CO2 being sequestered by the sea? So maybe, Paul, you want to have a crack about the directional aspects of that, and then Pete, you can tell us whether it might have been the CO2 would have gone land or sea, the effect.
Sure. Well, look, in the case of the fires in the east, the winds were westerly, so they blew offshore. And there's a good reason for that. The winds that are conducive to fire tend to be hot, dry winds. And in the case of New South Wales, Victoria, those winds are coming from the interior of the continent. Those westerly winds are coming from the interior of the continent where it's hot and dry, and wind, you know, the winds can pick up, can get dried, can become warmer. But in the west,